My name's Jules Danskin. I'm just going to speak a little bit longer, just to introduce the event very, very briefly. So many of you, I'm sure, are fans of Fireflies, which was also written by Luis Sagasti and translated by Fionn Petch, co-translated by Fionn Petch. With us today. Thank you, Fionn. Fionn's holding it up, so hopefully you can see him in the gallery view there. And as I said, please do offer your comments and suggestions in the chat. They're really, really welcome. We want to hear from you. Want to hear what you think of the book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, want to hear what you think from after the discussion, and again, any questions. So I'm going to introduce very briefly Fionn and Octavia in just a second, and we have a very special treat from the author himself. But first, I just want to hand over briefly to Sam McDowell, who is one of the two directors at Charco Press, who's just going to say a little bit about what Luis Sagasti's work means to Charco. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Jules. Hello to everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's wonderful to have everybody here. And again, echoing what Jules said, it's just appreciate it you take the time out of your day to join us. We do have a lot of fun producing these, a lot of stress to begin with. Then the event itself is enjoyable, and then afterwards with the wine, then things get even better. So, but it means a great deal for us to be able to share a little bit about what we're doing, provide a little bit of insight into the process that goes on behind the production of our books. And we're very excited with this one, with Luis Sagasti's newest musical offering, nicely color-coded with my backdrop here. As Jill said, this is the second work of Luis that we have published after Fireflies. And those of you who have been around with us since the beginning may recognize or remember that Fireflies was actually one of the very first books that Charco Press published. And it's important that when we embark on publishing a work, we are really looking to embark on a journey with an author. It's not just picking a single book that we think is great, it's picking an author who we think has a body of work, has a style that we can work with and grow and develop as they grow and develop, and we can hopefully bring more and more works to readers in the English-speaking world. And Luis's work, the fact that we've done 2 of these, of the first 5 books that we published in 2017, we've now published 4 of those authors again subsequently. So it's really exciting. I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to talk a little briefly about Luis and how he came to be part of the Charco family. And also he's listening, he's tuned in at the moment, so I have to be very careful about what I say. But Luis was an author that was on our radar right at the very beginning. We were living in Buenos Aires and toying with the idea of starting a small press and looking around at some of the writers who were causing a bit of interest at the time. And I remember that we went into this beautiful bookstore called Eterna Cadencia in Buenos Aires, and we picked up, I remember picking up a copy of Fireflies in the original. Down in the Eterna Cadencia is also a publisher in Argentina, and it's an example of a musical offering in its original form. And I remember we'd also heard Luis's name pop up here and there, and then just a month or 2 later, we were back at Eterna Cadencia talking to them about whether rights were available, and the journey sort of commenced there. So he really has been with us with Charco almost from before the very beginning. Luis's writing has really sort of strikes a chord with a lot of readers. With myself personally, I'm a massive fan of the way that he takes fiction and non-fiction and sort of intertwines them and weaves these beautiful tales. He has me quite regularly going off to investigate things that I think he's made up. I need to find out that they're true. And then there's other things that I think are true that I then go away and find out, hey, actually he's made them up. So he's always keeping me on his toes, and it always keeps me interested with his writing, and he does it so beautifully and so artfully. I don't want to talk too much more about that because I'm sure the others will get into it. I did just want to also take a moment to say thank you to Fionn Petch, the translator. Fionn is a translator of a number of our titles for those of you who are familiar with our works. what you may not realize is that Fionn is also a copy editor for quite a large number of our titles as well. So he's constantly working behind the scenes. And I have to say that, as well as being an astounding translator, Fionn's attention to detail, his work ethic, his thoroughness is just absolutely incredible. And I think we're very fortunate to have him as part of our team. So with that, I hope you enjoy this evening, and thank you all again for being a part of it.
Oh, thank you, Sam. That was lovely. Okay, so I think that's a perfect introduction. Without further ado, we have a special welcome from Luis himself. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will work well.
Hello, I'm Luis Sagasti. It's a pleasure to greet you. First, I would like to thank the whole Charco Press team. I'm really happy to be in such a lovely publisher with an extraordinary group of writers like Gabriela Cabezón Cámara, Ariana Harwitz, Carla Magliandi, Jorge Consiglio, among others. I would like to especially thank Carolina for the magnificent edition and Pablo for the extraordinary cover and the amazing work that Fionn has done with my book. He's true Jewish watchmaker. I'm going to read 2 little snippets. It's only take 45 minutes. Thank you so much for everything.
Okay, I really love that video, and yeah, we've got a 45-minute reading from Luis. No, we will be hearing from him a little bit later on. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers today. As Sam already said, Fionn is a huge part of the Charco team. He's based in Berlin and has joined us today, and we're so grateful for it. He's an amazing translator and copy editor, and you're going to love what he has to say about this book. It's just the most phenomenal little thing. He's going to be in conversation with Octavia Bright, who is a writer and academic, and she co-hosts the literary podcast and NTS radio show Literary Friction, which I myself am a big fan of, and hopefully lots of you are fans of it too. And if not, you must go and check it out. So, Fionn and Octavia, over to you.
Thank you.
Fionn, are you blushing after all of those?
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed. I need a... I don't know where to hide, actually.
There's nowhere to hide, my friend. I'm sorry. So hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're coming from. It's so nice to actually see all of your faces. I've done a bunch of Zoom events where you can't see the audience at all, and this is actually really nice. You are a lovely looking bunch. So I think I'm just going to start with like a very open question to you, Fionn, and then I think we should listen to Luis reading his work before we continue with the conversation, just so that everyone can get a sense of the original text as well as your translation. And I was thinking like how to introduce this book. I've got my copy as well, and yet everyone have a quick look at this beautiful cover, because it really zeroes in on what we're going to be talking about. But you know, is it essays? Is it fiction? Is it a mixture of both? As Sam said, you know, there are things in it you read and you immediately Google because you think, is this real? And no, it isn't. And then there's other stuff that feels like it's too strange to be real, and then it is. You know, classifying books is not always very fruitful, but it's also necessary to introduce them. So what would you say? Like, how would you frame this work?
Yeah, no, it is very hard to pin down what it is, whether it's a novel or an anti-novel. I mean, the simplest summation of it I could give is that it's a book about silences in music. Yeah, or to expand on that very slightly, I could say it's about music in extremis, or in different extreme situations. It's about music under the ocean, or music out in space. It's about music during war, music in concentration camps. But yeah, it's trying to speak, to write about silence more than anything, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it, actually. And also gives a sense, if you haven't read it yet, of why it's so difficult to sum it up.
I just confuse things further, I expect. But
yeah, but in the right way, in the spirit of the work, I think. So hopefully it will just entice people. Jules, let's go back to the shared screen and just listen to Luis reading.
El Wiegenlied de Johannes Brahms, la más célebre canción de cuna junto al Duérmete niño, es una canción que se ronronea sin letra, con la boca cerrada, casi por instinto. Brahms la compuso en 1868 para Hans, el segundo hijo de una cantante sueca llamada Berta Faber, con quien había tenido un romance siendo jóvenes. Al parecer esa melodía, o parte de ella, era susurrada por Berta al oído de Brahms. El compositor la retuvo por años y la ofrendó al hijo de su antiguo amante. ¿De dónde habrá sacado ella esa melodía? Es muy probable que se lo hubiera cantado su madre. La melodía acuna a los amantes por un momento para hacer de dos uno. Brahms escribe al padre del niño una inusitada carta. Se dará cuenta de que escribí Wiegenlied para el pequeño de Berta. Le parecerá que mientras ella se la canta al pequeño Hans, alguien le canta a su vez a ella una canción de amor. Es fácil imaginar lo que sigue. Un hombre a que la sinceridad gratuita le ha obsequiado un perplejo disgusto. El niño entra al cielo y su padre al infierno cuando escucha a Berta entonar la melodía. ¿Dónde se encuentra ella cuando la canta? Prohíbe a su mujer acunar al niño con esa canción. Nutre su insomnio esa nana. Se dice que la soprano la cantó en público en numerosas ocasiones. Era parte del repertorio cuando sabía que su marido no estaba en el teatro. Y así, el Wiegenlied se transformó en la canción de cuna más famosa del mundo. Y Hans, a quien estaba dedicada, el único niño no acunado con ella.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I don't know how many Spanish speakers we have watching, but if you don't speak Spanish, you know, there's some music for you, right? And if you do, then you have a different relationship to the words. But that's kind of a wonderful thing to bear in mind as we talk a bit more about this book. So Fionn, would you please now read your...
Yeah, I'll read the same section. I'm not sure I'll be able to read it so beautifully, but I'll do my best. It's,
yeah, you will.
This is from early on in the book, the first section. Johannes Brahms' Wiegenlied is probably the best known lullaby after Rockabye Baby. A song that can be hummed without words, with the mouth closed, almost instinctively. Brahms composed it in 1868 for Hans, the second child of a Swedish soprano named Berta Faber, with whom he'd had a fling as a young man. Apparently, Berta would whisper this melody, or part of it, to Brahms. The composer held on to it for years before offering it to the son of his former lover. Where had she got the melody from? What's most likely is that her mother sang it to her. The melody cradles the lovers, making them fleetingly one. Brahms wrote a peculiar letter to the father of the child. You will realize that I wrote Wiegenlied for Berta's son. You will have the impression that while she sings it to young Hans, someone is singing her a love song in turn. It's easy to imagine what follows. Such gratuitous sincerity left the man baffled and annoyed. The child in heaven and the father in hell when he hears Berta crooning the melody. But when she sings, where is she? He forbids his wife from putting their child to sleep with that song. The lullaby prowls his insomnia. It's said the soprano sang it in public on several occasions. It was part of her repertoire when she knew her husband wasn't in the audience. And so the Wiegenlied became the most famous lullaby in the world. And Hans, to whom it was dedicated, was the only child never to fall asleep to it.
Thank you. There's a lot to think about just in that section, isn't there? I mean, lullabies are so primal, aren't they? The kind of bridge that they create between the child and the parent who's singing them. I wonder if you had any in mind when you were translating that. Like, what was it like to get inside that piece of text?
Well, I have a child of my own, a young child who I still sing to when it's my turn to put her to sleep. And it made me think, I don't know, I found this section perhaps the most moving for myself.
Yeah, it's very relatable, isn't it? Because it's something that we all, no matter our nationality or our creed, or whether we are good at singing or bad at singing, I imagine most people were sung to at some point in their childhood, right? So there's a way of reaching for the universality of that experience. Do you think, are you a musical person? Do you have a lot of music in your life?
Well, that's, yeah. I know very little about music from a technical perspective. Yeah? I don't feel I'm someone who understands music. But at the same time, music is something that is profoundly important to me. You know, I'd say some of my, my own deepest experiences have come through music. And that's a kind of odd thing that, something that can mean so much to you without you feeling that you understand where it comes from or how it works, how it produces its effects. So yeah. I hope that didn't disqualify me from translating the work, given how much it focuses on music. But it isn't the work of musicology, on the other hand. So.
No, exactly. And what the book, for me anyway, and I wonder if you feel, obviously, especially with a book like this that leaves so much open to interpretation, every reader brings the veil of their own consciousness to the way that they interact with it, right? But for me, it really made me think about the relationship between language and music, and how when you hear a language that you don't speak, it's an abstraction. And then as you gradually learn it and you start to be able to read and listen and hear more meaning in it, it changes again. And there's so much in this book's structure that's about the repetition of things, the repetition of music, of chorus, of rhythms, of shapes, and also of narratives, like the way that Scheherazad's storytelling is woven through the different elements and fragments that Luis brings together. Yeah. And I feel like the architecture of the book is so vital to how the story is told. And I wonder, because I've seen that you write, you specialize in books on art and architecture, right? And I wondered if there's like a parallel between the translating of a book and the building of a building. And do you see it as like taking an edifice apart and rebuilding it, or are you like building a parallel copy?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting sort of metaphor for the work of translation, certainly. Yes, it's not one I'd really thought of, actually, but yes, it's like rebuilding the same building, ideally, the same edifice with the materials that are available to you. So say the materials that you would have to hand in one place, that you try and build the same final product. Yes.
How did you get into translation in the first place?
Well, it began really as a survival technique. I was living survival strategy. I was living in Mexico. I spent 10 years of my life in Mexico, Mexico City, and it was something that people asked me to do. And I began to see it as a way of making a living, first of all. And then gradually I began to discover the pleasure of it and the interest of it. And increasingly I began working with publishers in Mexico as you say, particularly art and architecture. And those texts, while not exactly literary, they're what we might call literary adjacent texts. So they're criticism, essays, and sometimes these essays would contain poems or fragments of fiction and so on. And I began to see that as an interesting, something that I would love to be doing. And I think in common with many translators, I don't make a living solely as a literary translator. I continue to do what I would call regular translation alongside this. I would say, it takes up more than half of my time. And I think most translators do have parallel careers, whether as academics or writers or teaching as well. But yeah, I do feel something of an outsider myself in the translation world, because I've never studied translation. I think these days it's more and more common that people will do a degree in translation before they go into the world. But I did it the old-fashioned way, I guess.
I mean, it worked for Borges. Why wouldn't it work for you? But do you think that you have, when you're translating literary works, I imagine it's quite a different process from when you're translating, straight prose, let's call it. Because, I mean, reading this book, I've not read it in the original Spanish, but there's such an artful turn to the way you've handled it. It's very clear that this is a very well translated book, and I've read a bunch of books that are not well translated. And what's interesting is I think that you can tell the difference,
even without knowing the source. Yeah.
Even without knowing the source.
Yeah, I think it's
the way that language has that musicality and rhythm and the sense of phrasing, right? Just like music. But I wonder how you feel your way into that as a practitioner.
Yes, a lot of practice, I think, and having an affinity with the author in this case, certainly. Luis is somebody I've come to admire greatly. I feel he has a sensibility towards the world which I share, and yeah, we've shared a lot of laughter together and a lot of very interesting discussions. I had the chance to meet him last September when he came to Scotland. He did a writer's retreat at Hawthornden Castle near Edinburgh, and so we spent some very interesting days together there.
Did you discuss the book with Luis while you were translating it, while it was a live endeavor?
The process, I produce a full draft, first of all. And I would go through, in fact, a couple of drafts, and then I would be gathering together my questions. And I more or less sent him all the outstanding questions that I had at the end. And interestingly, there were fewer questions with this one than with Fireflies. I don't know whether I'd become more attuned to his way of writing, or whether with Fireflies, I think there are more things that are going on which are harder to credit, and so he's playing around more with what's fiction and what's nonfiction. So I had to interrogate him on a lot more points there. But yeah, there is something in the his style is deceptively or even disarmingly simple, straightforward. He has these very they're mostly very short sentences. They're almost just statements, you know. A lot of the sections, maybe I should say a little bit more about the structure of the book. Most of it is very short sections, you know, which don't necessarily follow on from each other. They're, you know, just a brief paragraph which can read almost like an entry from an encyclopedia, you know. So you can have a brief few lines on a composer, say on John Cage or Messiaen, and then the next section is on something completely different. And so that's why it was also so hard to select a piece to read from. You know, it's always hard to choose a piece from a book which gives an impression, but in this case it's particularly difficult because the meaning of the book, the enchantment of the book emerges from the whole, you know? From the relations between these different passages. You know? So, but to go back to the language, it is, yeah, disarmingly simple, and it requires a lot of work to create that same sense of immediacy and simplicity in English as well. Because as you said, when he read his piece, you know, there was a musicality to it, and he was very eager for that to come across, and you know, that's what I hope that I've achieved.
I think you definitely have, but also the way you talked about that is, it kind of reflects the whole book, because you know, you can see everyone, it's quite a slim book, but there is so much in it. So much in it. And Fionn, when you were describing it at the beginning as really about silence as much as it's about music, and listening to you describe, I mean, I'm actually just going to open a page to show everyone just the shape, because I think it is important, as Fionn said, you know, these short little paragraphs that are kind of yeah, like small, almost encyclopedic entries. But I felt as a reader, and I wonder how you feel about this, Fionn, but that the spaces between the paragraphs, they were the spaces where I was doing the work to weave it into a narrative that made sense to me. And you know, it is like this process of building blocks, because different strands come back. So Scheherazade is threaded all the way through, the Beatles are kind of threaded all the way through, different artists appear, Tolstoy, Pollock, Rothko, Satie, and they come and they weave in and out of focus. And I feel like because it's the kind of book that doesn't tell you how to think, it offers you kind of building blocks, right? So different readers will take away different blocks and build their own version of the story. And so, you know, for me, the story that was the top level wasn't so much the strand of it that's about the role of music in conflict. It was very much the role of storytelling. So it was the Scheherazade thread that really stood out to me, and that I found myself reiterating into how I read the book, if that makes sense. Yes. And I wondered what it was for you, which was the strand that when you first read it, if you can imagine yourself reading it for the first time, which I'm sure was a while ago, before you worked on it, what was the thing that stood out?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. What you say about narrative has a lot in common with Fireflies. So I hope you'll read that as well. The Fireflies are the narrators, the sort of narrative urge to link disparate or apparently disparate things together. I think what I find most striking about it is the way that these very abstract images are what he uses to connect these very concrete lives and events. Now there's the idea of the circle, or the circularity of narrative, or the circularity of the piece of music. He begins with the Goldberg variations, Bach's Goldberg variations, which he begins with this, possibly apocryphal story that they were composed to help a nobleman, Count Kieserling, get to sleep at night to overcome his insomnia. So that's where we begin with the idea of sleep, the lullaby. And so the breaks between the different variations, or the silences. So that's what one image is, the circle, and then that recurs in different places, different times. And then there's the image of the night, of cold, of sand, very, very elemental things. And he uses these, very, almost Zen-like images to weave together these stories. I call him my connection man. Connection man is a character in one of my favorite novels, Ridley Walker.
Oh, I don't know. What's that?
Ridley Walker is the most wonderful novel by Russell Hoban. And a connection man is a kind of shaman. So I see Luis as a kind of shaman, because, as you say, he's not giving you answers. This is not a didactic book. He's giving you, he's giving you science, and it's up to the reader to interpret it. And each reading is like a performance of the book. It's like the score. And yeah, each reader takes away their own performance. And I'd also like, maybe I should ask you, but a question, because I've seen quite a lot of comments online saying, "Oh, this looks like a very difficult intellectual book," or something like that. But I really don't think it is. What?
A very intellectual book.
Like in the sense of, I've seen people saying, like, do I have to have read or know about all these people who he mentions?
No, I don't think so at all. No, I think, I think it's a book that makes you, or it made me as a reader reflect on the way we all collect stories and which ones stick and which ones don't. I know the work of Borges, so I was thinking of Borges the whole way through, but I think similarly to Borges, you don't have to know all of the references that Borges folds into his work in order to appreciate the work. And I feel like I would hate for I feel like sometimes when people use that term, like, oh, is it a very intellectual book? What they're saying is it going to require me to do any work? And I think that being an active reader is like a beautiful experience. So I think that this is a book that I would say it's a book that does invite you to be an active reader, but you don't have to know who all these people are. And actually, it's kind of a wonderful jumping off point to go and investigate some of the things that are mentioned, right?
Yeah.
But then
I think it's for a book for curious minds. All you need is an open and curious mind, and you don't need to know who all the, because he talks about an endless array of composers and artists and historical figures and so on. But he doesn't talk about them in a sort of, with a wink to the reader as though it's a sort of implicit reference that you're supposed to get. No, he talks, for example, inevitably he talks about John Cage's piece Silence, 4 minutes 33 seconds, which is the 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence, a score. But he doesn't expect you to know what it is. He describes, and he does so with most of the people he mentions, I think. So.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, actually, this links very nicely to my next question, which is about ekphrasis, which, if anyone doesn't know what ekphrasis is, it's the use of, I actually wrote down the definition so that I don't mangle this, but the use of detailed description of a work of visual art as a literary device. But I think you can expand it. And it made me think of, but obviously when I came to read this book with a view to us having this conversation. So I was also reading it with the idea of translation in my mind. And I was thinking how you can kind of extrapolate from ekphrasis, the traditional meaning of ekphrasis being this, you know, description of a visual work of art, to the translation as a kind of ekphrasis of its own, because it is conjuring the original text and it is replicating it without changing it, but it is also a palimpsest of it somehow. And I wondered if that jived with you, or if you think, oh my God, shut up, you terrible woman.
No, I mean, that's a very interesting. You know, as I was saying about metaphors and similes for translation, you've come up with 2 already, so that I never thought of. So, I mean, you know, and a palimpsest is a frequent one as well. The best, I don't know. There are so many for it, but yeah.
Sorry, I didn't phrase that really as a question, so it's like I can try and put it in a more direct way. But I mean, I actually, do you know what? I'm going to expand it, because I have a quote from the book, which, again, like I said, reading it through the lens of translation, this really, really stood out to me. And this is right towards the end, when Luis returns to talking about bedtime stories and popular music, and what happens when a story or a phrase gets repeated so much that we kind of internalize it. And the line is, to resign yourself to being the mere intermediary. That's pure liberation. And in it, he's talking about the singer of the lullaby. But I wondered, do you feel that as the translator?
It's wonderful that you picked on that very line, because for my editor, because the translation was edited by the wonderful Robin Myers, who is an American translator and poet, and she provided a great deal of inputs, because she's also a musician, so she was able to correct me on a whole lot of technical things. I put beside that very phrase, I highlighted that phrase and said something like, you know, this is me down to a T. So I really identified with that phrase. Yeah, it's a very Zen process. You know, this idea of being an intermediary, of just, you know, letting something flow through you, and to try and recreate it, to rebuild it with the building blocks of your own language, in a way that it echoes the original, but also makes perfect sense, or as near to perfect sense as you can in your own language. And, you know, that sometimes means that you have to change things. But yeah, you don't want the original to be showing through. At least not with too many sharp edges, at least. So.
Well, that I wanted to ask you about that, actually, because when I was a languages student, which was a long time ago, and I did a module on translation, there was a lot of talk about translation theory and things like whether you transplant a cultural reference from the original text that won't resonate in the translated language, or whether you find an equivalent. And I wondered if there was much of that, if that's a kind of theory that you employ, or if you didn't have to do anything or chose not to.
Yeah, well, it is something that's come up a lot in the other books which I've translated and edited. Particularly, there's been a lot of discussion with the translators of those books about how to deal with. In this case, Luis Sagasti's writing is sort of so universal in a way that there are very few sort of local cultural references. However, you do have to be very alert. You have to be constantly alert for local uses of Spanish, you know, because he's writing in Argentinian Spanish in the end. And despite the fact, you know, it's not a book that's set in Argentina, although some brief sections are, there's no dialogue as such. So he's not using, you know, Argentinian slang by and large. You do have to keep on your toes for a specific Argentinian use of a word, you know, a word which might make sense in Spanish from another country, so I have lived in Argentina for a few months, but obviously my main reference is Mexican Spanish. So, and that does, orient your reading, certainly, the reference that you have. And there were a few changes that I had to make, so hopefully the readers sort of wouldn't even have to think about them, but he talks about a lullaby that his mum sang to him when he was a child, and he describes how, as a baby, before he knew what the words meant, the words "El lobo feroz, tan atroz, tan atroz" sounded like a beautiful lilting sound to him. And tan atroz means something like so terrible, or so terrifying. The lobo feroz, the ferocious wolf, so terrifying. Tan atroz, tan atroz. And of course, we don't have that lullaby in English. So I had to work out a different lullaby, which lullaby would fit. And handily, that same lullaby, which we mentioned in the bit I read, the Rockabye Baby, has the chorus, "Down will come cradle, baby and all," which, when you think about it, is horrible. It's about a baby falling out of a tree. So, but the baby and all worked perfectly to replace that. But again, it's something, now I've just ruined it for everybody, but it's something that the reader should just read and for it to make sense for them. And I think they shouldn't have to be thinking, unless they want to. I mean, if they want to think about the translation process, then that's fine. But they should be able to just read it as, without having to think, well, it wasn't actually Rockabye Baby that he was listening to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I feel like there's been a shift in the publishing world in general in the last few years, and long may it continue, to there being more space for translated fiction, but also for translators getting more space on the cover,
Absolutely.
Like think about the translated fiction that I read as a young person that came to me, and it was just whatever it was, it was just Tolstoy, or it was just Proust, but I couldn't tell you which translation of those books I read. And possibly the translator's name wouldn't even have been on the cover. And now I feel like, thankfully...
Yeah, certainly not on the cover. If you're lucky, on the title page, possibly just on the legal page.
Right.
If there. I've seen books with no reference to the translator at all. It's great that translators are getting more visibility. Of course, we're being dragged out of our cloisters, kicking and screaming, and put in front of screens, and have dozens of strangers in our living room, like some kind of weird dream. I think it goes hand in hand with those the debates about translation also becoming more visible, and I'm slightly anxious about some of the, as I say, I'm an outsider in the translation world, and I've never studied translation theory, and when I sort of glimpse what's going on from afar, or I read about these things, I'm sometimes slightly disconcerted or just surprised. But the way people talk about translators as writers, and translators expressing their own voices in the translation, particularly. And of course, it is a kind of writing. We are the authors of our own translation, legally, in a legal sense. It's on the copyright. And you're using a lot of the tools from the writer's toolbox, and one of the joys of translation is seeing sort of from the inside how that process has come together. But I don't know, I consider it a different kind of thing. Obviously I wouldn't see myself as an author. And if I did my own writing, and if I were to publish it, I would see that as a completely different kind of achievement.
Yeah, that makes
so there is, it's most likely that I'm not deeply enough involved in those debates and those discussions to really understand where they're coming from. I think there's possibly a whole academic background to that. But there is this sort of assertion of translators as writers that sometimes makes me a little uncomfortable, to be a bit controversial, but
please do bring it. You heard it here.
Bit of controversy there.
Well, actually, because as I think Sam or Jules mentioned in the intro, you work as an editor also for Charco Press, and you mentioned when we were chatting before this started that you have, obviously that means that you're editing translators, and the way that you relate to translation, it seems, is as the translator as some kind of glorious channel, basically, which is a beautiful idea. And it sort of fits with the idea that the translator is able to be free from ego. And I wonder how does it feel I guess when you have your editor's hat on, you're a third removed from the text, the original text, right? So how do you relate to the translated text as editor? And do you think that translators can be free from ego, or do you think that's like a halcyon dream?
Yeah, no. You could overdo the Zen thing, and this idea of it being this sort of fluid channel. Of course, it's an ideal, and it's quite false as well, because there is necessarily a creative process going on. There is no pure kind of mirror between one language and another that you can even hope to achieve, so that they're always you're always having to just seek that ideal, but never achieve it, I think. So I think Charco Press specifically are quite collaborative compared to other, in the process, compared to other publishers. Historically, I was astonished to learn that it's normal that the editor doesn't know the source language. It was standard that only the translator would know the source language, and the editor would sort of tidy it up and look for mistakes and so on, without knowing the source. And that was just standard for, has been for forever, basically. I don't know if Sam could also speak to their idea of it being more collaborative process. But it's something I enjoy a lot, is working with other translators. And I think, the translator always gets the final say, of course, but I have had some situations where there's sort of a lack of readiness to accept suggestions, shall we say. Even when it's clear that there's that there's a misinterpretation going on. It's not just a creative choice, that there's just a misinterpretation of the source, and I think it's kind of crazy to expect that somebody would get every single turn of phrase right and every single word in the original right. It's like expecting an ice skater to get perfect tense all the time. So I think a collaborative process is a positive thing, and that's not to say it's translation by committee. Of course not. That would be awful. It's the roles are very clear, and in the end, it is a creative decision on the part of the translator
I wonder if, because language obviously is something that is mutable over time, and I feel like, I wonder if the translation of a musical offering that you have done at this point in your life would be the same if you were to do another one in 15 years.
Yeah, no.
how we relate to the language we use, and also like how we relate to our own lives through the literature that we read or translate. You know, I like the idea of that, but what do you think as a professional? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I'm probably misquoting, but I think Michael Hoffman said something like, you know, the line he translated in the morning, he translated it different in the afternoon. There's a phrase like that, but yeah.
Was he hungry?
He may have been. Yeah. Absolutely, because I mean, you are bringing your own knowledge, of course, you know, and it's your own vocabulary. I think you have to be very, very hungry in your vocabulary, and you have to expand your vocabulary to encompass the work that you're dealing with. But you know, inevitably, you favor certain words, or you favor certain turns or phrases, and so it would be very interesting to do a close analysis of different translators and see whether there are, you know, patterns that emerge. You know? But you know, there are translators who are writers. I read, you know, of course, a recent book I discovered by a Romanian author who's been sort of forgotten for a long time, Mihail Sebastian. He's a writer from the 30s, and it's now, I think it was recently reissued in Penguin 20th Century Classics, translated by Philip O'Kelly. And it was such a wonderful translation. I mean, as you say, sometimes you can just tell. You know, you don't need to know the original. You don't need to be comparing it. Sometimes you can just tell. That on the strength of that, for the very first time, I picked up the translator's own book of writing. He has a book of stories called The Pleasant Light of Day. Very beautiful book of stories. But, you know, I wasn't expecting those stories to sound anything like his translation, of course. You know, so the idea that you would expect some sort of continuity, and, you know, if there were, I think that would be suspicious, in fact.
Yeah. That's a good point. I'm going to flip open now to the Zoom group chat, because a few people have pinged over some questions. So Daniel Hahn made the point about the Rockabye Baby being a cultural replacement, and says, very nice.
Thanks, Danny.
Richard says, was anything else swapped to make more sense in English? Putting you on the spot a tiny bit there.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, there were a couple of very small things. An interesting thing that I was very tempted to swap and didn't was you mentioned, I mean, you know, it's hard to talk about the different elements without people having the whole overview of the book, but you mentioned Scheherazade, the narrator of the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. It's kind of complicated, but Luis Sagasti refers to Borges referring to a specific night, which is the 602nd night of the Arabian Nights, yeah, which, and Borges refers to it on multiple occasions in, you know, in different texts. And for him, it's a sort of epitome of the book, because it's the night where, he says, Scheherazade tells her own story. So she tells the story of a concubine saving her life every night by recounting a story to the Caliph. No? But this story is, you know, very hard to track down. This night, the 602nd night. And if I couldn't find an edition of the Arabian Nights in English that would have, because obviously, so there's a fragment from that night in the novel, in A Musical Offering. There's a sort of 10-line fragment. And so I wanted to find a published translation of it, you know, which is normal practice for when a book is quoted. And I couldn't find that night anywhere. So I put out a sort of cry for help on Twitter, and amazingly, very quickly, somebody came up with the edition, which was a Penguin edition, volume 3, the third 1,000-page volume. And the night was completely different. The text was different. Not only that, the 602nd night was on page 602
Get out.
of the edition, which just blew my mind. So I'm determined to find out one way or another from the editors if this was a little nod to Borges, because Borges seeing this as the sort of emblematic night of the Arabian Nights. But the text in English, it wasn't the same night, it wasn't the same story at all, but it had some kind of similarity because with the bit of text that was quoted there, because there was an idea of like an enslaved girl in that story, even though the story was completely different. So it was just layer upon layer of strangeness.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm going to pick up this question from Martin, who says, Octavia has referred to Borges several times. What is Sagasti's relation to him? School of Borges, the anti-Borges, or neither? I mean, Borges is such an immovable edifice for Argentine writers, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. Yeah, and I think all Argentine writers get this question, and they're heartily sick of it. So, if Luis is listening, he's probably rolling his eyes. Another of Charco's authors, Jorge Concilio, replied to a similar question in an interview, and he said something like, "Yeah, he's just this sort of this rock. You can neither ignore him nor can you, you want to get away from him, but you can't. Like he's a sort of vortex.
He's everybody's daddy, isn't he?
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there are as much as he'd like to distance himself, he does pay homage to him, and he plays with that here in this book.
And it's fun actually. Like if you are familiar with Borges, it's fun to see that in this text. Declan O'Driscoll has just said John Cage attempted to free music performance from the ego of the musicians, who are a type of translator, by introducing elements of chance which were beyond their choice, which is a fascinating thought.
Thanks, Declan. That's interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. And then, Jules, are we okay to run over a tiny bit? There's a couple more good questions here. Yeah, okay, great. She's nodding. Excellent. Naveed asks, given that the book plays so much with interpretation and allowing the reader space, how easy or hard was it to avoid eroding those ambiguities in translation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's something I became very aware of translating Sagasti. This sense that you have to let the reader choose, because, as I said, with these very short sentences, very brief statements, sometimes they're so sort of tentative and so indeterminate that you just have to map them as closely as you can, and you have to map the ambiguity along with it. And it's a risk. I think it's very good to be aware of as a translator, of not imposing your own view on it. Because there's this narrative about, my translation is my reading of the text as though I'm any other reader. I think that's mistaken. As I say, I think each reading is a performance of the text, of the score. But I think among all those analogies or similes for what translation is like, a musician performing a score is one I don't really agree with as a translator. Mm-hmm. That you have to, and especially when you feel an affinity with the writer. This is something I put in the translator's note actually to Fireflies. There's a danger of feeling that you have a lot in common with the author, that you love the book, because it's one of translation's perils to identify too closely, because then you don't allow the space for what actually makes his ideas truly original, or your author's ideas truly original. Because you just say, oh yeah, I know what that means because I've had that same idea, I've had that same experience, I've had that same thought. So you write down your own thought, your own experience, and you don't pay close enough attention to the text to just let it be what it is in its own originality.
Yeah, it's like empathy is a vital element, but it can't be the main, it can't be the only one.
Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise you just end up writing it about yourself. That's a really interesting thought. I'm going to do one more because I'm sure everyone's a bit screened out, but we've got the last one from Tobias Ryan. So I'm just going to read this and then we'll see. Without wanting to be too mystical or wordy, in the book, discrete moments in time seem to share an energetic field or resonate on the same frequency. Is this feeling of connection something you willfully access, or do you trust that through your immense ability to translate the words, its effects will be transmitted?
Wow. Hey, Tobias. Yeah, I think you're ascribing powers beyond my ken to to me. Yeah, I think, picking up on what I was saying about him not being the book not being intellectual, in a sense that it's not dry. It's not he's more of a shamanic figure, and he leads by instinct. I think he follows these connections by instinct, and his genius lies in the selection and in the concatenation of the elements. Because when he's like a internet browser of sorts, or endless hyperlinks. In theory, the book could go on forever, and what's the pleasure of it and what makes it work is the selection of those elements and the very careful curating of those elements. And I think while obviously he's very kind of conscious of what he's doing, there is a lot of instinct in that as well. And I don't know, I see myself just as, if he's Don Quixote going going out into the world, I'm just his Sancho Panza. I'm on my donkey. I don't know.
That's a very cute image.
Trying my best to keep up with him. So, yeah.
I wonder, I've got one last question. Oh dear, I've just made everything the wrong size. Here we go. I've got one last question, which is that, as you say, like each reading of the book is like a performance because of the way it's structured, and as we've talked about, there's a lot of ekphrasis within it. There's a lot of reference to musicians, visual artists, as well as other writers. And I felt reading it, it's a book that I would love to see it have a life in other forms of art. Yeah. I would love to see like an exhibition curated around this and have musicians respond and have artists respond. I don't like, how do you feel about that as a thought?
He would love that idea. I'm really? Sure he would. Yeah.
Luis, can we make it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think about, who I compare him to, and often, rather than other writers, I often think about filmmakers as well. And yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure he would love to be part of some kind of multisensorial symphonic work.
Yeah. It could
he loves symphonic rock, prog rock, that sort of thing. He's written a book on Led Zeppelin. So I think he wants to start a rock group as well.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, I reckon we've got enough members.
Whether or not he calls it Rothko, which he suggests, or Rothko, he says, one of my favorite lines in the book, Rothko would be a great name for a rock group.
I would endorse that fully. Fionn, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And
likewise,
Charco, thank you so much for getting me on board for this, because it's been such a joy to read it and think about the book. And I've already pressed it into the hands of a couple of friends, actually. So
thank you.
Yeah, it's been a joy. I'm going to flip this back to Jules for closing statements. But let's think about maybe if there's a way we can do some kind of online reading to the sound of some prog rock. We can get like a live artist, like a Pollock-esque figure.
That's right.
Anyway, thank you.
I'm up for it.
Jules, over to you. Oh, good. Okay, good.
Thank you so much, both of you, Octavia, Fionn. That was just such a treat, and it was really lovely as well seeing all of your thoughts coming through. And it just leaves me to just sort of finish up a little bit of housekeeping. Sam, do you want to finish up with a word? Are you quite happy? I saw you've unmuted yourself. Feel free to jump in.
That was just in case that I needed to say something. But seeing as you've opened the door to me, I'll seize the opportunity just to say a huge thanks to Octavia and to Fionn and to everybody that came along and joined us tonight. I found it interesting, and I also have to say A huge thank you to Luis Sagasti. Hola maestro, muchísimas gracias for being a part of this as well, and for delivering to us this beautiful work that we now can read, thanks to Fionn's careful handling of it. That's all, and hope to see you all again. Those that have read it or have yet to read it, actually, if you feel free to send through thoughts, comments on the book. It's certainly an interesting read. Thanks, Jules.
Okay, so just leaves me just to finish up with a couple of things. Again, this is the second event that we've done, both been so different and both been hugely enjoyable. Our previous event for Holiday Heart is up on our YouTube channel, and this one will also be as well. So if you've enjoyed it and you'd like to see it again, you absolutely will be able to. Or if you think someone else has enjoyed the book and would enjoy this discussion, please do get the word out there. And we'll really look forward to seeing you on the next one, which was going to be for Dead Girls by Selva Almada. We will be releasing details of what we're going to do for the launch of this one. It's out on the 3rd of September. So I would strongly encourage you to go and buy it, and certainly to go and buy Musical Offering. Or Fireflies, if you've read Musical Offering and really enjoyed it. And just as a little incentive to make it a little bit easier, we've got a very special exclusive discount code for 48 hours only. It is Musical Offer. So if you go to charcopress.com, 20% off all individual titles for 48 hours only. It's going to end at 8 p.m. on Thursday. So please do go fill your baskets with Charco books. And thank you so much again for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we can't wait for the next.
I have to jump in just to be clear that there are a couple of exclusions to that code. Sorry to bum everybody out with the fine print, but I just need to make sure that it's for individual titles only, so it doesn't include bundles or tote bags. They're excluded, but all individual titles, print and ebook. I know, but I just want to make sure. I don't want any disappointed. We want no disappointed customers. We only want happy people. Don't want anyone getting nasty surprises. So I just thought I'd clarify that.
Happy people.
Sorry. Only happy people. That's all we want. Only happy people.
Excellent. Well, if you happy people have enjoyed it, then please do let us know on Twitter and Instagram. Ping us an email if you've got any thoughts for what we could do for events and that kind of thing. And I think we were talking just before the event about how this opens up, all these virtual events are opening up so many possibilities, and we're really enjoying experimenting with them. So thank you so much again to Octavia and Fionn for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And we'll see you on the next one. Good night or good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good morning.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.